Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our conversation on California farm workers in times of climate change. We're coming to you live from across the rainy Central Valley. My name is Melissa Montalvo. I am a reporter with the Fresno Bee and Fresno Land, where I cover economic inequality. And I'm joined by an amazing group of reporters and panelists who are going to bring life to this conversation today. And this conversation was brought to you by the La Abeja reporting team. We cover Latino issues throughout California, and if we give out a free weekly newsletter. So thank you to all those who subscribed and who found out about us through the newsletter. And a special thank you to everyone who submitted a question for our panelists today. We're going to try to address as many of those as we can in our conversation. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, this conversation about climate and farm workers is especially pressing, given our historic floods and rains that are devastating farm worker communities. And of course, this comes after a 3-year record heat and drought. So we have a lot of ground to cover. And we're going to break up today's session with 3 different segments. In our first conversation, we're going to focus on the largest ever academic study of farm worker health. Then we're going to move on to talk about the day-to-day experience of farm workers and hear from a farm worker directly who was impacted by the floods. At the end, we're going to talk about what's happening in Pájaro and Planada, the communities that you must have heard about given the recent flooding. And we'll also talk about some legislative solutions. Again, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. So I'm going to start off this conversation with our team at UC Merced Community and Labor Center. I'm joined by Edward Flores, who is our professor of sociology at UC Merced. He's a co-lead on the UC Merced Farm Worker Health in California study, and he is also an expert on issues of race, immigration, labor, and civic religion. Thank you so much for joining us, Ed. We are planning to have Ana Padilla as well, Executive Director of UC Merced Community and Labor Center. She's having a little logistics challenge, but we hope she can join us for half the conversation. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
You might be on mute.
Can you hear me?
Can't hear you yet. Can you unmute yourself?
Oh.
Can we hear? Let's see.
Let me try to jump off and then join.
Perfect.
You can hear me?
We can hear you now. Thank you, Ed. Well, thank you so much. Let's just jump into it, Ed. You know, I have your report right here in my lap, and it's over 100 pages long. You interviewed over 1,200 farm workers with a number of community groups and covered a lot of ground. You talked about, there's rich data on healthcare access, workplace conditions, living conditions that farm workers experience, and a lot more. But we really want to just focus on, climate change and the impact that climate change has had on farm workers. So can you just give me a quick 2-minute overview of some of the major findings and that might shed light on how and why farm workers are disproportionately impacted by climate change?
Sure. So the state of California has always faced challenges in regards to climate and disaster. About once every 100 years, there's a series of atmospheric rains that create flooding across the entire state. And with the accelerations in warming in the planet, we can expect those types of massive rains to now occur once every 30 years. And we just saw this past winter. So what's happening is nothing new, but there's the intensity and the regularity of it is only going to increase, with warming. Farm workers are on the front lines because, as our study and other studies have shown, the majority of farm workers in California are undocumented, do not have access to unemployment insurance and other forms of aid due to federal prohibitions. And so when disaster strikes, not only were they already in a more precarious position to begin with, but then they have fewer means to weather that challenge. So what our study um, really helped to understand was just in a global sense how disadvantaged farm workers are, and especially during moments of crisis like the ones that were experienced in Pajaro and Planada recently.
Thanks, Ed, for that question or for that answer. And um, were there any findings from your report that jump out at you, and maybe some of the, maybe a couple, five or so bullet points of just some of the top findings that came out of your report?
Yes, absolutely. Um, Typically, research in the field of public health and even in the social determinants of health, when it's such research is done in the U.S., focuses on a number of aspects like housing and air and water. Uh, what typically is much less examined is work. And even when work is discussed in public health and in the field and under the rubric of the social determinants of health, um, the uh, employment rates and days missed due to work injuries are some of the key factors that state agencies and researchers look at, as opposed to other facets of work, such as like the quality of work. And what our research uh, did was to ask questions that previously hadn't been asked in major studies of public health on farm workers. We found that nearly 1 in 5 farm workers have experienced some form of wage theft, that 43% worked in a workplace that was in non-compliance with the California, having a written heat plan posted under California law. Um, we found that 59% of farm workers were undocumented and did not have access to unemployment benefits. We also found that 36% would be unwilling to report um, non-compliance on behalf of an employer um, in regards to wage and hour or health and safety violations. And lastly, we found that nearly 2/3, 64% of farm workers who had who would be unwilling to file a report against their employer express fear of retaliation either through loss of hours, job loss, or deportation.
Thank you for that overview, Ed. And we received a question from Arle Alston of Pescadero, um, who said basically that they were thinking about these undocumented farm workers, and especially those that are aging, who might not have access to Social Security, who might not have family support, either locally or maybe in their countries back home. Can you just tell us a little bit about the demographics of the farm workforce? Are they in fact aging?
Yes, and so the average age of a farm worker in our survey, in the NAS, in the American Community Survey as well, is about 40. And this is a decade older than the median age of a farm worker a few decades ago. The age of farm workers has slowly been going up um, with the generation of young adults from Mexico that had migrated in the 1970s, the historic wave of migration that began in the 1970s and continued for a few decades. Um, those persons were all in the baby boomer generation, and they are very close to, many of them are beginning to retire or will soon retire. And so we're facing a wave of retirees in this industry, unlike any that has come before, because previously undocumented immigrants did have access to unemployment benefits before the 1970s, because many farm workers were native born before the 1970s, but now this demographic has shifted so much. So the increase in age creates a lot of policy questions. Who are the farm workers that are going to take these jobs when current farm workers begin to retire and exit the workforce in the next decade or two, um, as well as uh, questions about the safety net to those farm workers that have spent decades um, paying unemployment, working and paying taxes, and whose employers have been paying unemployment insurance taxes on behalf of them, subsidizing a system that we all benefit from. What safety net is going to exist for them in terms of unemployment benefits or social security benefits? So those are the questions that I think increasingly in the next few years we're going to begin to have to grapple with in the policy realm.
Definitely. Thank you, Ed. And your research also found that 37% of men and 47% of women reported at least one chronic condition, health condition. So that was diabetes, hypertension, and anxiety as the top three. How do you anticipate climate change will impact these types of health issues for farm workers in the coming years?
Climate change is really just a symptom of a problem. I mean, it has real effects on our conditions in the workplace, right? So there's record heat, wildfires, and so the intensity of heat and the number of days of extreme heat that farm workers are going to have to work under is only going to increase. The prevalence of wildfires and inhaling wildfire smoke is only going to be a greater challenge, given current trends. Those are issues that are affecting farm workers immediately, but at the same time, these are symptoms of a much deeper problem, which is that for a long time, our approach to agriculture has been extractive. The amount of investment on behalf of corporations that are outside of the Central Valley that do large industrial farming for profit, and the types of practices used to create the greatest profit margins possible that involve use of tons of pesticides that go into the air, that pollute the soil, degrade the soil, pollute drinking water, pollute the air. These all pose challenges. So climate change itself is going to present greater challenges for farm workers in terms of exposure to heat and the long-term effects of heat stress on kidneys, on health and well-being, but also too we can't forget about the fact that much of what we're seeing with climate change is being driven by practices that we have that are not environmentally sustainable, that in themselves already have short and long-term impacts on the health and well-being of farm workers.
Thank you, Ed. That brings me to another point in your study related more to farm worker housing. So your report found that 92% of farm workers are renters, and many of these renters live in substandard housing. Can you tell me a little bit more about the findings related to housing and maybe how you think these historic floods will impact farm worker housing?
Sure. The 92% in our survey, we found that 92% of farm workers were renters, and that 1 in 10 did not have access to water at home. So with the rain and the floods that have been occurring, people have not only been losing work, but they're also now experiencing fear of eviction if they've fallen behind on rent. The average household size of a farm worker household is 4 persons per household. The average household has 2 children. So these are entire families, not just single men, who are here for a few months to work in the fields and then return to their home country. These are families that are being displaced, that are being uprooted by the disasters and the lack of public aid that they're able to rely upon.
And on that note of public aid, Ed, we have heard, in our reporting, and also I'm sure you've heard through your studies, that farm workers during periods of drought reported income loss. They reported, the drought and the fallowed fields meant that they lost work. And we're hearing similar comments during these periods of floods and rains. And we had a number of questions about this access to aid. So can you tell us a little bit about the policy recommendations in the report related to the safety net and beyond?
Yeah, there's a number of policy recommendations in our report. really all of these recommendations are aligned with shifts in statewide policy and emerging initiatives. So we recommend investing in expanding the economic safety net to workers that don't currently have a safety net, economic safety net, like undocumented immigrants that are not eligible for unemployment insurance. But also too, such as the current SB 227, which would create an unemployment benefit system for workers that are currently excluded from unemployment insurance benefits in California. But also too, there's a number of recommendations that um, in our report that are focused on increasing the amount of resources that are um, that are provided to the agricultural industry for development, um, and particularly for the type of development that would raise industry standards. This is aligned with the state's efforts at economic and climate resilience. The high road economic development approach is one that the governor and the state um, have relied upon as a blueprint for advancing on ambitious climate goals. So yes, there's some recommendations, and they're very much aligned with existing proposed legislation or new initiatives that that are just beginning.
Thanks so much, Ed. And I wish we had a whole day to talk about all the findings of this report because there's tons of great data. And I recommend everyone who's interested to learn more to go to UC Merced Community and Labor Center's website for more details on the report and the findings. I want to get to one of our last questions here that was submitted by George Mesaron of Sacramento. He asks if UC Merced Community and Labor Center will be gathering any information on how the winter storms are impacting farm worker health.
That's a great question. We've been approached about doing needs assessments in some communities that were devastated by the recent weather events. The farm worker health study that I shared some data from was conducted between 2021 and 2022. It was part of a 2-year project that we spent a lot of time developing. So in the short term, we might do some needs assessment. But for the type of work that we did in the farm worker health study, it took a whole team of researchers that were really dedicated and a lot of just institutional development to get the study off the ground. So we're probably going to be sharing some of these findings with policymakers, giving town halls, speaking publicly, and we might do some needs assessment depending on how quickly we can respond to to some of the events that have happened.
Thank you so much for that overview, Ed. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this segment, and I'm going to hand it off to my fellow Fresno Bee reporter Laura Diaz and Juan Esparza Loera of Vida en el Valle.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Laura Diaz, the Latino Communities Reporter at the Fresno Bee, and I'm joined by Juan Esparza Loera, editor of Vida en el Valle. In this second segment, Juan and I will speak with Heriberto Fernandez of the UFW and Central Valley farmer Joe Del Bosque about how farm workers are being impacted by climate change. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Before we get started with the conversation, we have a quick about 2-minute video we want to share with you all from a farm worker, Gilberto Hernandez Ramirez, I interviewed in Tulare County last week.
Pues, un poco frustrado por la inundación que hubo, ¿verdad?
Júntalo.
La primera frustración fue que nos sacaron del campo Linel, ¿verdad? Y nos movimos aquí al INSI y nos encontramos con las inundaciones, entonces emocionalmente sí se frustra uno. Y como ha llovido y realmente trabaja unos 2 días o 3 por semana, no nos alcanza para pagar la renta. Pues más que todo que se fijara en la gente campesina, en los trabajadores del campo, que son los que sacamos para que los políticos, la gente de más recursos tengan sus frutas, sus verduras, que lleguen a su casa sanas, limpias y no se fijan en uno. A los trabajadores hay un poco de recursos, no hay ayuda mucho. Y sin embargo, hay industrias, como ahora para los que tienen empresas, un negocio, sí le están ayudando, que yo sé, para que sigan su negocio. Y pues ellos sí, les ayudan, y para los trabajadores que ganamos un sueldo bajo, no tenemos una ayuda suficiente. No se nos ha dado el trato que se les debe dar a los campesinos. Es lo que yo pienso. Falta más que se enfoquen en eso.
And like Gilberto, there's thousands of people affected across the Central Valley in California. So to begin our conversation, this first question is for Heriberto. What are you hearing from farm workers in these past few months in light of the recent floods, like we saw Gilberto's house flood?
Laura, we're hearing devastating stories like the one Gilberto just shared from across the state. Farm workers are not only losing their jobs because of the devastating winter storms, but also their homes are inundated. A lot of folks are not living in their homes currently. They are having to relocate their entire families, oftentimes leaving their property behind, their belongings, living at a different community other than theirs. Like the example that Gilberto mentioned, he was living in the Lionel Farm Labor Camp. Now he's living somewhere else. The effects of farm workers are feeling because of climate change and because of these current winter storms are twofold. I mean, one, you're dealing with the loss of your job. Already, many farm workers during the winter season don't work that many hours, but also now you're dealing with the devastating consequences that is losing your property, your home, and not really having a social safety net to back you up when you most need it.
Thank you, Heriberto, for sharing that with us. And Joe, nice to see you again. My question is, your farming is not impacted heavily by flooding, but yet the weather is affecting you. What do you hear from workers, and how has the recent rains impacted your plans for planting and work?
Well, first of all, we feel for those workers in places where they're experiencing flooding, like in Tulare Lake, in Planada, in Pajaro. We're a little more fortunate here on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley that we've not experienced any flooding. But nevertheless, we are impacted in that our planting is being delayed. And people are losing work because of that. Typically, we start preparing for planting in February, and we work all of March getting ready and then start planting our crops. This year, our people have only worked a handful of days. When it rains, we don't work. When it's too wet, we don't work. So unfortunately, they've only worked maybe an average of a couple of days a week in between storms. Our crops are being delayed. We should have planted tomatoes 2 weeks ago, and melons we should be planting this week. They're probably going to be delayed another week. So what that means is not only did they already lose some work here in the late winter, but our harvest is going to be pushed back. And so instead of starting harvest, say in June 25th, they're going to be starting maybe July 5th. So they lose more wages during harvest. We as a farmer, we miss out on the market during that time, which is important to us. So it's basically kind of shortening our season for both the farmer and the farm worker.
Okay, thank you. And my question next is for Heriberto. I know that the UFW Foundation has been busy providing assistance like food, some rental assistance to farm workers who have been impacted by the flooding. Where does the funding come from, and have you been able to get assistance for funding from the state or local governments?
Yes, so since January 9th this year, the UFW began accepting applications for funds that have been provided by the federal government. This is the Farm and Food Worker Relief Program. And this pool of money was given to farm workers and to farm worker serving organizations to give to the farm working community for folks who have been impacted by the effects of COVID. And since January 9th, we've been giving out thousands of $600 payments to farm workers that have been desperate to receive, like in the case of Gilberto, desperate to receive any aid whatsoever. And so we're now in 2 agencies from the state of California to figure out how we can also provide similar resources, similar aid to farm workers in the communities like Planada and, folks like in Lionel as well and across the state. But we need to move fast and we need to act now.
And I understand the funding for the $600 checks has come from the USDA. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, from the United States Department of Agriculture.
And where are you as far as dispersing those funds? Do you have enough to reach everyone?
We understood since we got the funds that not everyone was going to be able to, access these funds, right? What we've been supplied in funds far does not come close to the demand. The demand is much greater than what we've been given in terms of funds, but we're going to be advocating at the federal level to ensure that the federal government knows that there is a tremendous demand for more aid and more relief. And now because of the winter storms, even more so. So right now we have been working with our partner organizations. The UFW alone has processed over 13,500 applications in California. And the demand and the volume of calls keeps coming.
Thank you.
Talking about the safety net and these relief funds, Heriberto, we received a series, several questions from our community related to the social safety net and what resources are available, especially during these historic rains and floodings, as it is raining here in Fresno as we have this conversation. And the next question we have is from Maria Gonzalez of Madera and Ellen Wittes, if I pronounce that correctly, of Berkeley. And they both asked, how can farm workers provide for their families during this time of rain? Are undocumented residents entitled to all disaster services and benefits? And if not, which are restricted, and what can California do to ensure all residents have access to these benefits?
I mean, the bottom line is that farm workers, especially if you're an undocumented farm worker in this country, you have very little access to social safety net programs offered to other citizen, residents of this country and of this state. We're working tirelessly to ensure that both the governor of California understands that farm workers need stronger protections, but also stronger benefits, especially in an industry that we so heavily rely on for our economics, for our economic growth. The 4th largest economy in the world, California, we're barely touching the surface in terms of what we can give to farm workers. Very little in terms of resources is given, and the little that we do have to give to farm workers themselves had to fight for it. Just in recent years, farm workers did not receive unemployment benefits. That was given, a couple of decades ago through hard-fought sacrifices. There are still many exclusions that farm workers face across the country that we have to correct today.
Thank you. And Joe, you have been a longtime spokesperson, officially or unofficially, for farmers in the San Joaquin Valley, not just for the local media, but the statewide, national, and even international media. why is it important for you to make sure that the farmer's viewpoint gets across? And can you talk also a little bit about your outlook as climate change impacts your livelihood?
Well, it's important for us farmers to speak out, and it's important if our farm workers could speak out also. Oftentimes they're shy about doing that. Um, and, when the media comes out to my farm, I'll always offer some of our farm workers to voice, their thoughts to the media. So the world needs to know exactly what goes on at the farm in reality. What does it take to grow the food that they eat? Who are the people that do this? And so I do advocate a lot for that purpose, so that people know what goes on out here in agriculture and hear from the people in the field with the boots on the ground. As far as climate change goes, we don't know what that's going to be. Um, Possibly, there's going to be more floods like we're having now. That's something that the state I think, needs to address, how to control these floods in the future. Just like how do we manage the droughts? Those are things that we need to do on a state level. As far as in the field, we're concerned about things like exceptionally hot summers, where we as farmers are doing what we can to keep our farm workers protected, having water, having shade, having rest breaks, and so forth. Even on my own farm, we're trying to add more shade to our moving packing platforms so that they have more shade as they're working. It's something that we're trying to invest in to provide them with that added protection wherever we can. So it's important that we first of all have good safety practices and heat illness protections for our workers, because that's probably where our workers are going to be most affected. And I work a lot with a nonprofit called AgSafe to train more farmers and their supervisors to learn how better to protect their workers.
Thank you.
In the time we've had today, we saw Filberto's experience out in Tulare County with the floods, with the loss of property in his home and wage because of limited working hours. We've heard from the UFW Foundation about what advocates are hearing and how organizing is happening. We've heard from Joe Del Bosque's farm experience and how through his own work, he's also being challenged by climate change and trying to keep his farm workers safe. And this question is for both Joe and Heriberto. Pam Flores from Fresno asks, if local citizens are interested and want to help, what can they do to support essential workers, like farm workers, during these difficult times of crises like flood and drought?
One of the biggest rewards I've seen in these last few years, both during the pandemic and now through the winter storms, what's been so gratifying to see is the number of people who have turned out to every single one of our events, whether it's food distributions, cash assistance, or helping farm workers in need. The number of volunteers who've come out in support of farm workers through the foundation, through the UFW Foundation. We had a historic, we've all been impacted by COVID, but the response that we've seen from the community has been important. I encourage everybody out there who's listening, who's watching this, to please reach out to the UFW Foundation on our social media platforms. Get connected with us, reach out. There's always a way to pull together an event, whether it's food distribution, whether it's working with us on all sorts of ways to collect both funds or collect resources for farm workers. This is a call out for you to help out and reach out.
I agree with Heriberto. We need to help our farm workers in time of need, like when they need food distributions or clothing or whatever. As far as helping out, what they can do, I would say that if they could help some of these nonprofits like AgSafe that help farmers provide a better, safe program on their farm to provide a safer environment on the farm, support these organizations so that they can reach all the farmers in the state. You know, we're reaching out to as many as we can, but we need to pull more in so that they all have, you know, have good training on how best to protect their workers and to provide a better work environment.
Thank you, both of you. That's about it for our section tonight with the limited segments we have. But for everybody interested, as Joe and Heriberto mentioned, feel free to reach out to the communities, to the organizations. We're trying to help farm workers and to us too at La Abeja. We're more than glad to share the information we have in our reporting on. Again, thank you, Joe and Heriberto, for your time and sharing your insight with us tonight. Our next segment is presented again by Juan Esparza Loera of Vida en el Valle and Matthew Miranda of the Sacramento Bee.
Thank you, Laura. For our final conversation on what the state can do to address farm worker health, we have two special guests. First, we have Speaker Designate Assemblymember Robert Rivas, who represents the Salinas and Pájaro valleys. I'll let Juan introduce our next guest.
And we have State Senator Ana Caballero, who represents Merced, but has also represented the Salinas area in the past. And I understand a big chunk of that area has been added to her responsibilities due to redistricting. So welcome, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you as well for joining us. For the first question, I want to ask, we're all aware the last few months have been particularly devastating to farm workers in both of your communities. Could you both provide us with an update from your districts and tell us what is being done to help this community? Assemblymember Rivas, if you can go first.
Yeah, sure. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this panel. And there's no question that the rains, the storms we've had this year, especially the recent flooding in Pájaro and the Salinas Valley, they have really impacted our region. It's disproportionately affected our farm worker communities, and really in particular our low income and undocumented residents. And they're hurting right now, as we heard from Gilberto in the video that was just shown at the start of the last panel. And so I can tell you what we've been doing. We've been doing the work on making sure we do all that we can to link our families up to support systems for housing, for healthcare. Our office has been very engaged to keep residents safe and informed, and most importantly, helping them access the resources to help them rebuild and to recover. And this has included working very closely with the senator, working very closely with our Central Coast state legislative, our delegation, working with the governor, with his staff, working with our congressional representatives, really all of us working together to take additional action that will directly help local residents. And this has most recently included advocating for a major disaster declaration from the federal government, which we know just found out this afternoon that the governor and his staff they made that request this afternoon, which we're very, very thankful for, because such a declaration is critical, because it would, it's going to help open the door to new FEMA resources, assistance and funding for residents. And I have to add really quickly that I'm so thankful for the governor. A couple weeks ago, he came to the Central Coast, came to the Pájaro Valley to see the impacts that the floods have had, the thousands of residents that have been impacted and displaced. And so thankful, not only for his visit, but for his engagement. The actions he has taken as a governor to support our region, last year signing critical legislation to fully fund the repairs and the maintenance that need to happen at the flood site there on the Pájaro levee system. He's done more than any governor has in the past, and so very thankful for that.
So I think the really sad thing is that hundreds of families have been impacted because of the flooding. Levees have given way And what we know is that we need to do a better job of managing heavy rainfall. And that requires us to be able to get into the rivers and the creeks, clean them out, and make sure that they're safe. And so my heart goes out to everybody that's been flooded and that has been living in emergency shelters, and that are trying desperately to get back into the homes that have been devastated because of this flooding. We've been working with nonprofit organizations who stand ready to take donations to make sure that families get those resources. We've contacted, and as the assembly member said, there are various teams that are working because my district crosses various assembly districts, and we've been working as team members. We were able to get some help from the commercial establishments. Lowe's donated some gift cards so that people could replace the heaters in their residences that had been flooded and were no longer operable. Refrigerator, electrical appliances, and I was really pleased that the governor visited Planada and had an opportunity to see the devastation and to come into the community and talk to people and to make his commitment to do everything necessary to be able to help the flood victims. And what we were able to do right away is that really close to Planada is the Felix Torres Migrant Center, which is a center that has housing for migrant farm workers that was empty at the time. So we were able to move families very quickly into that migrant center. They've been there and been able to live so that their kids can get back to school. They've got their own apartments. And as their homes get retrofitted, meaning that the drywall gets pulled out and the furniture gets replaced, they're able to move from that migrant center back into their homes, and it hasn't impacted the need for migrants to be able to move back into that center. So a lot of work has been done, and I have to second what the assembly member said. We owe Governor Newsom a real thanks. He's been on the spot and he's been there when we've needed him.
Thank you. Not all counties have responded the same when it comes to providing assistance to undocumented farm workers, either during or after the pandemic and right now during this winter storms. Today, Stanislaus County became only the third county in the state to fund a farm worker resource center. What can the state do, or you as lawmakers do, to make sure that a farm worker in Tulare County is afforded the same type of assistance as a farm worker in Monterey County? And we'll start with State Senator Caballero on this one.
So let me tell you, this is probably one of the most frustrating aspects of how we do business in the state of California, is that we rely on the counties to be our partners. And when the pandemic struck, there was so much misinformation about how the disease was transmitted, what an individual should do to keep themselves safe, and whether they should, as essential workers, should show up and what they needed to do, that every county was doing it differently. I had 6 counties that I represented, and I ended up doing a town hall for every county separately because they were doing things differently. And I wanted to make it very clear to people, if you live in this county, this is what you need to do in order to comply with the requirements of the county, right? And they're our partners, but they all operate differently and they all have different boards of supervisors. And it was very frustrating, I do have to admit. So part of our public health discussion has to be how can we use the model that we use, which is that the counties are our partner. We can't be the state can't be everywhere. And if they're our partner, they have to at least follow a basic framework when we hit a disaster, so that we can make sure that all the residents are getting the right information. Because as you know, Juan, a lot of the people work in one county and live in another. And so who should they listen to? You know, it was very frustrating.
Correct. And Assemblymember Rivas, same question.
Yeah, I think that's, I completely agree with Anna. I think that, that's what's so challenging about our state. We're so large and so diverse, and, certainly, agricultural regions across our state, they vary, the Central Valley from the Central Coast and, the Coachella Valley. But, there's no question that there are disparities in how our counties address farm worker issues, as Anna highlighted very well. But to be clear, no state, has done more or will do more for our farm workers, or for their families than the state of California. But as we also know, that supports that these efforts, that they aren't enough, especially in these most challenging times of natural disasters, as we experienced during the pandemic. But certainly that's not for a lack of trying. There's been, some previous legislation, current legislation that's moving. I know just last year, my colleague, State Assembly Member Steve Bennett, he was the lead author. I was a joint author for legislation. I believe it was Assembly Bill 941 from last year, which created this grant program to fund the construction of county farm worker resource centers. And so this is legislation that's already having a positive impact. I know in our region, in the county of Monterey, they are utilizing over $800,000 in state grant funding to build a farm worker resource center in a very vulnerable community in the southern part of Monterey County in the city of Greenfield, which is a disadvantaged community and which is a community that certainly is going to benefit from having a resource center, a place, that farm workers can come, that the community can come when it comes to the dissemination of information on the accessibility of state programs for, that residents will qualify for. But also to this point, I think Heriberto with the UFW Foundation, the previous panel, he spoke about this, just how challenging it is, especially for our undocumented residents who are not eligible for resources, who aren't eligible for some benefits, and so ensuring that we do all we can to support our most vulnerable populations. This is a state in California where we certainly have done a lot in the way of expanding healthcare coverage through Medi-Cal to our undocumented residents, but certainly we have to find ways to support these residents and their families, in stronger ways.
Thank you.
So if I could jump in here really quick, I think one of the issues that's frustrated us so much is that the state of California, because of Latino elected officials, has really made it a priority to include the undocumented worker in our programs, whether it's the DACA program or the sanctuary state, the benefits during COVID. They weren't enough, but we tried to make sure that undocumented workers could access them. We are different than most of the other states in that if you ask us, we'd give them all a green card and they'd be able to then qualify for all of the benefits that are available through the federal government. But they're not now. And so I'm working on a bill. We'll see whether we can get it through the legislature. It's not been successful in the past, but it's basically to allow the governor to negotiate with a president about a program that would allow us to identify farm workers and agricultural workers as essential workers and give them permission to work, which then gives them permission to stay here as long as they're eligible. And so if no other state wants to do that, that's okay. Let California do it. Let us be the leaders in this. And if we do that, that'll make a tremendous difference in our community because they could come out of the shadows. Most of them live in families with U.S. citizens. The family could stay united, and we'd show the appreciation to them for standing up and being the essential workers during the pandemic and making sure we had food on our tables.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Senator. This next question is directed at Assemblymember Rivas. In a few months, Assemblymember, you're going to become the first speaker in more than 50 years to come from a rural district. 7 of the last 8 speakers to come from Los Angeles County. So you're somewhat of a rarity there. What will this mean for farm worker legislation priorities moving forward?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. And I have spoken very openly about my upbringing since I first ran for elective office some 13 years ago. Being raised in farm worker housing, having been raised by immigrant farm workers from Mexico, it's helped to shape my entire life, my worldview, and it's provided the drive and the purpose that I needed to pursue a career in public service. And I will say that early life experiences matter, and experiencing poverty, poor housing, and living some conditions. Understanding my grandfather's struggle as a lifelong farm worker, his lack of basic rights in the fields. Experiencing these things certainly helped to shape my understanding of how state and local policy can help or how it can hurt people. And so certainly farm workers should know, just like all of our vulnerable and disadvantaged, our communities should know from across our state, that I plan to ensure that I continue my work to be a champion for them, to ensure that the door of opportunity remains open here in California. As I've said many times, if you were to, if you would have told me as a child, when I was growing up in Almaden Vineyards, that I would one day serve in the state legislature, and serve as Speaker of the California State Assembly, I would not have thought it possible. And so this truly is, the California Dream in action. This is a state that has always been a beacon of hope, of equity, of opportunity. And here at our state capitol, having the opportunity to work with a Senator, Ana Caballero, us together, we must work to ensure that we protect and we grow the California dream so that everyone, even including our farm workers and their children, that they can prosper here in California, which is, the golden state. There's no state better than California.
Thank you. My question, Senator Caballero, you spoke about trying to provide more benefits for undocumented, and the state has been really aggressive, if I can use that word, in recent years. Everywhere from expanding health care access to undocumented workers, making the state's earned income tax credit available to them as well. The state real ID card also. What has been the pushback from constituents? Are they like all 100% on board, or are you still getting some pushback on this? We'll start with Senator Caballero.
It depends on, I think it really depends on who you talk to and what the interests of the group are. When I talk to farmers, they're interested in a workforce that is that's available, that is they're supportive of immigration policies that would legalize undocumented workers. I think there's concern about the state spending money on undocumented workers, but generally, my interaction with people, I mean, you end up with people on the internet that are ugly about things, right? And so those comments come on all the time, but you don't know where they're from because it could be anywhere in the country. But I think most of the constituents that I talk with, and what I do is I do house meetings. So I'll ask leaders in the community to invite 30 or 40 people to come to their house. And then we have a conversation about what I'm working on. And I hear comments about things that they're concerned about. It's really my way of reaching out and saying, what are the issues that keep you up at night? And people are generally very supportive of including undocumented workers as part of our community because it's their neighbors. It's their it's who their granddaughter is dating, right? We have a community where people are I think open to the idea that if you're going to work hard and you're going to be a law-abiding member of the community, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to change your legal status and to become a contributing member of society. And there are many, many people who work their entire life. And this is what concerns me. They spend their entire life working, but they're undocumented and they have no benefits at the end. They don't get Social Security, despite the fact that they paid millions into the system. They don't have they don't have retirement programs, and the fastest growing population of homeless are seniors. It's individuals over the age of 55. And my view of that is the reason is because people have worked blue collar jobs, low paying, and they don't have any savings. And one illness, one disaster, and you end up homeless. And I fear that as the farm workers age into retirement and they have no benefits, that we'll see more farm workers end up on the street, which just is intolerable. So we've got to do something in our state to be able to make sure that we've got the resources to take care of people who have really worked hard all their lives. But getting back to the constituents, I think there's great support for farm workers. What concerns people is whether we can afford it.
Okay, thank you. And Assemblymember Arriba, same question. And by the way, I want to say that the vote by the Stanislaus County Board of Supervisors for the Farm Worker Resource Center was 5-0, and there was no one that spoke in opposition to the funds being spent.
That's great.
Assemblymember?
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, so I completely agree with the senator. I have found, certainly in the conversations I've had across the state and certainly in our region and the district I represent, that residents, they largely understand the importance of eliminating barriers for our undocumented residents to participate in society, to participate here in California and in our country. Undocumented residents, as the senator said, they are our neighbors, they're our classmates, our coworkers, and even our friends and family, and so unfortunately, the stagnation of federal immigration reform has left, many undocumented residents, many undocumented people here in California, across the country, just left them in limbo, especially when we have these challenging times like natural disasters and these emergencies as we experienced throughout the pandemic. And while other states have sought to make less of our undocumented residents, to demonize them, our state has actively ensured that our undocumented residents can access necessary resources, and our supports, the policies that we have passed here as a state, bills that we have passed, all of our efforts to support our undocumented residents, it's good policy, but it's also the right thing to do. And that's why you can count on California to do that much more, to always push that envelope to support our most vulnerable residents. And certainly when it comes to our undocumented residents that do such critical work, as we have seen, especially in agriculture, our farm workers who contribute so much to our economy, who pay taxes, like my grandparents who, certainly they became citizens in the early 90s. But they played by the rules, they worked hard, they contributed, and certainly our state was better for their work.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to squeeze in one last question. If you can just both keep it a little brief because we are running out of time. But just kind of moving to present day, the Latino Caucus released its legislative priorities earlier today. There are a few bills that caught my eyes that I think would directly impact the farm worker population here in the state, specifically the undocumented population. I know it's hard to rank them, but if there's one that each of you could pick out as one of the most vital, would you mind sharing that? Maybe starting with Assemblymember Rivas.
Yeah, so there's really not one that I can pick, but I can tell you that as former vice chair of the Latino Caucus, certainly appreciate all the work that is done, by our caucus, the largest ethnic caucus of any state legislature anywhere in the country, and so I certainly look forward to working with my colleagues to advance many of those bills, and certainly really looking forward to working one bill in particular that I know of, and that I participated in press conference recently, was by Assemblymember Juan Carrillo, and it was a bill to extend unemployment, some benefits to our undocumented senior citizens.
So you have more information than I do. I will tell you, I was in committee all day, and then I jumped on this Zoom. So I would say my own bill, right, which is SB 831. I think that's a number of my bill that would provide an opportunity to negotiate with the federal government over legalization for undocumented. And I'm hoping that's a Latino caucus priority.
That's an important one too. Well, yeah, thank you to both of you. That was very helpful. Again, I'd like to thank Assemblyman Rivas, Senator Caballero, as well as Ana Padilla, Ed Flores, Joe Del Bosque, Heriberto Fernandez for sharing these valuable insights on farm workers, health, and climate change. Please stay in touch with La Abeja team by subscribing to our free weekly newsletter, and make sure to follow us on Twitter at LaAbeja_CA to keep the conversation going. Also, if you can, please consider supporting local journalism with a subscription to power more conversations like this. With that, we'll close up. Have a great rest of your evening, and thank you so much for joining us.